The bullet whistled past Elijah Hawkins's head, missing his good eye by a mere inch as he dove behind the overturned wagon. The year was 1875, and Julesburg, Colorado, was no place for a man who couldn't shoot straight anymore. "Damn it all to hell," Elijah muttered, fumbling with his revolver as dust kicked up around him. The bandana covering his left eye had come loose in the commotion, revealing the scarred hollow where his eye had once been. He didn't need to see the disgust on people's faces to know it was there. He'd been ambushed on his way back to his small ranch outside of town. 3 men had appeared from behind the rocks, demanding the money he'd gotten from selling his cattle. The measly sum he'd earned hardly seemed worth dying for, but pride had kept him from handing it over immediately. "Come out, Hawkins," one of the men shouted. "We know you can't aim worth a damn now." Elijah gritted his teeth. It was true. Since losing his eye in that saloon fight 2 years ago, his depth perception was shot to hell. What had once made him feared throughout Colorado territory, his quick draw and deadly accuracy, was now just another bitter memory. A second bullet splintered the wood near his head, showering him with fragments. He needed to move, but where? The open terrain offered little protection, and his horse had bolted at the first gunshot. "I got no quarrel with you boys," Elijah called out, trying to buy time. "Take the money and leave me be." Too late for that, one eye. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Elijah swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of fear. This wasn't how he'd imagined dying, shot down like a dog by common thieves. He closed his good eye for a moment, steadied his breathing, and prepared to make his final stand. That's when he heard the crack of another gun, followed by a surprised yelp of pain. "Get away from him," a woman's voice commanded, strong and unwavering despite the danger. Elijah risked a glance around the wagon to see a woman astride a chestnut mare, rifle raised confidently against her shoulder. She fired again, and one of his attackers clutched his arm, cursing loudly. "This ain't your fight, lady," the leader shouted. "It is now," she replied, working the lever on her Winchester with practiced ease. The would-be robbers exchanged glances, clearly reconsidering their odds. After a tense moment, they retreated, disappearing into the scrubland as quickly as they had appeared. Elijah remained crouched behind the wagon, unsure if he was more shocked by his sudden salvation or by the fact that it had come at the hands of a woman. "They're gone," she announced, dismounting with fluid grace. "You can come out now." Elijah stood slowly, painfully aware of the dust coating his clothes and the patch hanging loosely from his face. He hastily adjusted it, securing the leather over his empty socket. "Thank you, miss," he said gruffly, "but I had it handled." The woman's expression made it clear she wasn't buying his bravado. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with auburn hair peeking out from beneath her wide-brimmed hat. Her face was sun-kissed but not weathered, her green eyes sharp and assessing. "3 against 1 and you pinned down with nowhere to run?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. Interesting definition of handled. Elijah felt heat rise in his face from anger or embarrassment, he wasn't sure which. "I don't need your pity," he growled. The woman stared at him for a long moment before securing her rifle in its scabbard. "It ain't pity," she said simply. "It's common decency, something in short supply these days." She extended her hand. "Tessa Porter." Elijah hesitated before taking her hand. "Elijah Hawkins." "I know who you are," she replied. "My pa spoke of you, said you were the fastest gun in 3 counties before." She trailed off, her eyes flicking momentarily to his covered eye. "Before I became half a man," Elijah finished bitterly, Tessa's expression hardened. "That's not what I was going to say. And if that's what you think, then maybe you've lost more than just an eye, Mr. Hawkins." Before he could respond, she whistled sharply. From the direction the bandits had fled came the sound of hooves, and Elijah's dappled gray gelding trotted into view. "Figured they wouldn't have gone far," Tessa said, catching the reins and handing them to him. "Your horse seems loyal, at least." Elijah took the reins wordlessly, still trying to make sense of this unexpected encounter. Women in these parts knew how to handle a gun, sure enough, but few rode alone and fewer still would intervene in a gunfight that wasn't their concern. "What brings you out this way, Miss Porter?" he asked, his curiosity finally overcoming his pride. "Heading to town for supplies," she answered, mounting her mare again. "My ranch is about 5 miles north of here." "The old Wilson place?" Elijah asked, surprised. He'd heard someone had bought it after old man Wilson passed, but hadn't paid much mind to the rumors. "That's right." "Been there 6 months now." She adjusted her hat, shielding her eyes from the late afternoon sun. "And you, where were you headed before those men decided to introduce themselves?" "Home," Elijah said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of his ranch. He mounted his horse with less grace than he would have liked, still feeling the ache in his bones from diving for cover. "It's a small spread about 3 miles east," Tessa nodded. "Well, Mr. Hawkins, since we're headed in the same direction for a piece, perhaps we should ride together." "Safety in numbers and all that." Elijah wanted to refuse. His pride demanded it, but practicality won out. Those men might still be lurking, waiting for another opportunity. Besides, he was curious about this woman who handled a Winchester like she was born to it. "Lead the way, Miss Porter," he said finally. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves against the hard-packed earth. The Colorado landscape stretched around them, vast and beautiful, the mountains in the distance crowned with the last remnants of winter snow despite it being early May. "How long have you been in Julesburg?" Tessa asked eventually. "Going on 5 years now," Elijah replied. "Came here after the war looking for a fresh start." "You fought for the Union," Elijah nodded. 19th Indiana Infantry, you," Tessa laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the air around them. "I was 12 when the war ended, Mr. Hawkins, but my family was from Pennsylvania." "Union through and through?" Elijah felt foolish for asking, though he couldn't have known her age. She carried herself with such confidence that he'd assumed she was older. "And what brought you out west, if you don't mind my asking?" Her smile faded slightly. "Same as most, I suppose." "Looking for something, freedom maybe, a place where a woman can be judged by her mettle rather than her marriageability." "And have you found that here?" Elijah asked, genuinely curious. Tessa considered this for a moment. "Sometimes, other times," she shrugged. "Well, let's just say I've gotten good at reloading quickly." This drew a reluctant chuckle from Elijah. "I imagine you have." They reached a fork in the trail and Elijah gestured to the right. "My place is down that way." Tessa nodded but hesitated before turning her mare toward town. "Mr. Hawkins," she said carefully, "I don't mean to overstep, but those men, they might come back." "I'll be ready if they do," Elijah said, though they both knew it for the empty boast it was. "I've no doubt," Tessa replied diplomatically, "but should you find yourself in need of assistance?" "Well, the Wilson place isn't far." Elijah bristled at the implication that he couldn't handle himself. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Porter, but I've been looking after myself for a long time." "Of course," she said, her face carefully neutral. "Good day to you, then." As she turned her horse toward Julesburg, Elijah was struck by a sudden realization of his own rudeness. This woman had likely saved his life, and he was treating her offer of further help as an insult. "Miss Porter," he called after her. She reined in her mare and looked back at him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for what you did back there." A smile touched her lips. "You're welcome, Mr. Hawkins. Take care of yourself." Elijah watched her ride away, finding himself strangely reluctant to turn toward home. There was something about Tessa Porter that intrigued him, a strength combined with a kindness he'd rarely encountered since coming west. Most people either avoided him because of his disfigurement or treated him with a pity that felt worse than contempt. She'd done neither. "It ain't pity," she'd said. And for the first time in 2 years, Elijah found himself hoping that might be true. The following morning, Elijah awoke to the sound of hooves approaching his modest cabin. His hand instinctively reached for the revolver he kept beside his bed, even as his mind registered that a bandit wouldn't announce their arrival so openly. He dressed quickly, secured his eye patch, and stepped onto the porch, squinting his good eye against the morning sun. To his surprise, it was Tessa Porter approaching, leading a packhorse laden with supplies behind her mare. "Miss Porter," he called out, setting his gun down on the porch railing, "this is unexpected." "Good morning, Mr. Hawkins," she replied, drawing her horse to a stop. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," he said, though in truth, he wasn't accustomed to receiving visitors. His cabin was functional but Spartan, a reflection of his solitary life since his injury. "What brings you out this way?" Tessa dismounted and secured her horses to the hitching post. "I was in town yesterday as planned and heard something that might interest you." She approached the porch, carrying a small bundle. "But first, I brought you these." Elijah accepted the package, unwrapping it to find freshly baked biscuits, still warm from an oven. The simple gesture caught him off guard, touching something inside him that he'd thought long buried. "You didn't have to," he began. "I know," she interrupted. "But my ma always said never to call on a neighbor empty-handed." Elijah gestured toward the cabin door. "Would you like to come in?" "I can offer coffee, at least." "That would be fine, thank you." Inside, Elijah busied himself with the coffee pot, acutely aware of Tessa taking in his sparse living quarters. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, the accumulation of a life pared down to essentials. "You like to read," she observed, examining his collection. "Helps pass the time," he replied, setting the coffee to boil. "What was this news you thought might interest me?" Tessa took a seat at the table. "Those men who attacked you yesterday, they've been causing trouble all over the county. Robbed the stagecoach last week, shot a rancher near Sterling the week before." She paused. "Sheriff Wallace is putting together a posse, leaving tomorrow morning." Elijah poured the coffee once it was ready, setting a cup before her. "And you think I should join?" "I think you were a renowned marksman once," she said carefully. "And that kind of skill doesn't disappear entirely, even with—" She gestured vaguely toward his eye. "You'd be surprised what disappears," Elijah said quietly, sitting across from her. "Why tell me this? Why not just let the sheriff handle it?" Tessa sipped her coffee before answering. "Because they'll keep coming back. Men like that, they smell weakness. And once word spreads that they robbed the one-eyed former gunslinger and got away with it." She let the implications hang in the air. Elijah knew she was right. His reputation, tattered as it was all that stood between him and becoming a regular target for every outlaw passing through. "And what about you?" he asked. "Will you be joining this posse too?" A wry smile crossed her face. "Sheriff Wallace made it quite clear that a woman's place isn't chasing outlaws, regardless of how well she handles a rifle." "That's a shame," Elijah said, surprising himself with his sincerity. "Based on yesterday, you'd be an asset." "Well," Tessa said, seeming pleased by the compliment, "not everyone sees things that way." They fell into comfortable conversation as they finished their coffee and shared the biscuits. Elijah found himself relaxing in Tessa's presence, drawn to her straightforward manner and quick wit. It had been so long since he'd engaged in genuine conversation that didn't involve pitying glances or uncomfortable silences that he'd almost forgotten the pleasure of it. "I should get going," Tessa said eventually, glancing out the window at the sun's position. "I've cattle to tend to." "By yourself?" Elijah asked. "I have a hand, Miguel Rivera. Good man, but it's still more work than 2 can comfortably manage." She stood, brushing crumbs from her riding skirt. "What about you? How do you manage your spread alone?" "I've scaled back considerably," Elijah admitted. "Just enough cattle to get by. It's manageable." Tessa nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying, that he'd diminished his ambitions to match his diminished abilities. "Well, Mr. Hawkins, I appreciate the coffee, and I hope you'll consider what I said about the posse." Elijah walked her to her horse, helping her secure the lead line to her packhorse. "I'll think on it," he promised. As Tessa mounted up, she fixed him with a direct gaze. "You know, losing an eye doesn't make you less of a man, Mr. Hawkins. It's what you do with what remains that defines you." Before he could respond, she tipped her hat and rode away, leaving Elijah standing in his yard, her words echoing in his mind. The next morning found Elijah in Julesburg, standing outside the sheriff's office as a group of men gathered for the posse. He'd spent a restless night thinking about Tessa's words, about the life he'd retreated into after his injury, and about the man he'd once been, the man he might still be if he found the courage. Sheriff Wallace looked surprised to see him. "Hawkins," Didn't expect to see you volunteering." "Heard you could use experienced guns," Elijah replied, keeping his voice steady despite the doubt churning in his stomach. The sheriff's gaze flickered to Elijah's eye patch. "No offense, Hawkins, but we need men who can shoot straight. This ain't charity work." A murmur of agreement went through the assembled men, some of whom Elijah recognized as those who'd watched him struggle in the months after his injury. "I can still outshoot half the men here," Elijah said, fighting to keep his temper in check. "And I know the territory better than most." "That's so," challenged a voice from the back of the group. A tall man with a weather-beaten face pushed his way forward. "Prove it, then." Sheriff Wallace seemed ready to intervene, but Elijah raised a hand. "What did you have in mind, Jenkins?" The man Jenkins gestured to the end of the street where empty bottles were sometimes used for target practice. "3 shots. Furthest bottles. You hit 2 out of 3, you can ride with us." It was a fair challenge, but Elijah knew the odds were against him. His depth perception wasn't what it once was, and he hadn't practiced regularly since the injury. "Make it 4 out of 6, came a familiar voice, and Elijah turned to see Tessa approaching, leading her mare. "And if he makes it, I ride too." "This isn't women's business, Miss Porter," the sheriff said firmly. "Is that right?" Tessa replied coolly. "Seems to me you need every capable gun you can get, regardless of who's holding it." The men exchanged glances, some amused, others uncomfortable with the situation. 4 out of 6, Jenkins repeated, smirking. "Both of you make it, both can ride, miss it, and both of you go home." Elijah looked at Tessa, who nodded slightly. "Deal," he said. They set up the challenge at the edge of town, 6 bottles at increasing distances, the furthest nearly 70 yards away. A small crowd gathered to watch, curious about the spectacle. "Ladies first," Jenkins said with mock gallantry. Tessa stepped forward without hesitation, drew her revolver, and fired in rapid succession. 5 bottles shattered, including the furthest one. Only the second furthest remained standing, and Elijah suspected that was deliberate on her part. "Your turn, Mr. Hawkins," she said quietly, stepping back beside him. Elijah drew his Colt, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. He took a deep breath, trying to quiet the voice in his head that insisted he would fail, that he was half the man he once was. He raised the gun, focusing on the closest bottle first. His shot rang out and the bottle exploded into fragments. The second as well. The third bottle wobbled but remained standing as his bullet grazed its side. Murmurs ran through the crowd. 3 bottles remained, and he needed 1 more hit. "Remember," Tessa said softly beside him, "it's not about what you've lost, it's about what remains." Elijah steadied his breathing, adjusting his aim to compensate for his altered vision. He fired again and missed the 4th bottle entirely. The crowd's whispers grew louder, and Jenkins chuckled. "2 more shots, one eye. Better make 'em count." Elijah lowered his gun for a moment, clearing his mind of everything but the target. When he raised it again, he wasn't thinking about his missing eye or the men watching or even the outlaws they were hunting. He was thinking only of the path between his bullet and the bottle. His 5th shot shattered the 5th bottle. 1 bottle remained the furthest one, wavering slightly in the morning breeze. Elijah knew he'd missed more difficult shots in the past, but never with so much riding on the outcome. Not just his pride, but Tessa's as well. He fired his final shot. For a moment, silence hung over the street as everyone strained to see the result. Then came the distant sound of glass shattering, and a cheer went up from some of the onlookers. Jenkins spat in the dust. "Lucky shot." "Luck or skill, he made the challenge," Sheriff Wallace said, looking both surprised and slightly impressed. "Both of you can ride with us." He looked at Tessa. "But I ain't responsible for what happens out there, Miss Porter. This isn't a Sunday picnic." "Never thought it was, Sheriff," she replied evenly. As the posse began to disperse to make final preparations, Tessa approached Elijah. "Nice shooting," she said. "You could have hit them all," he observed. "Why miss one?" A smile touched her lips. "Didn't want to show up all these fine gentlemen too badly." She grew serious. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Hawkins? These men were hunting, they're dangerous." "So was I once," Elijah replied. "Maybe I still can be when needed." The posse set out an hour later, 12 men and Tessa. They followed the outlaws' trail northwest toward the Wyoming Territory. Sheriff Wallace, for all his initial reluctance, proved to be a competent tracker, and by nightfall they had a good idea of where their quarry was headed. They made camp in a sheltered valley, keeping the fires low to avoid detection. Elijah found himself sharing a fire with Tessa, both of them somewhat ostracized by the other men. "Why did you really come to my cabin yesterday?" Elijah asked as they ate a simple meal of beans and jerky. "You could have just told the sheriff about the posse." Tessa poked at the fire with a stick, considering her answer. "I suppose I saw something in you that reminded me of my father," she said finally. "He was a proud man too, lost his arm at Gettysburg, came home a different person." She looked up at Elijah. "He let it diminish him, stopped living, just existed. I watched him fade away year by year until there was nothing left but bitterness." "Is that why you came west?" Elijah asked. "To escape that memory?" "Partly," she admitted. "But also to prove something to myself, to the world, I'm not sure, that a woman alone could make something of herself out here." She smiled faintly. "Not so different from what you're trying to prove today," Elijah nodded, understanding dawning, "that a one-eyed man can still be worth something." "You were always worth something, Mr. Hawkins," Tessa said quietly. "You just forgot it for a while." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from the perimeter. One of the men on watch had spotted movement in the distance. The camp quickly mobilized, weapons checked, and horses secured. "Probably just deer," the sheriff said, "but we'll double the watch tonight. Hawkins, you and Miss Porter take the second shift." Elijah nodded, secretly relieved to be assigned a task that showed some level of trust. He and Tessa settled in to get what rest they could before their watch. Several hours later, they sat side by side on a rocky outcrop overlooking the camp, the night quiet except for the occasional call of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. The moon was nearly full, casting the landscape in silver light. "Tell me about your eye," Tessa said suddenly, her voice soft in the darkness, "if you don't mind talking about it." Elijah was silent for so long that she must have thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "It was a saloon fight, stupid, really. A card game gone wrong, too much whiskey. The other fellow accused me of cheating. Words were exchanged, then punches." He touched his eye patch unconsciously. "He had a knife I didn't see until it was too late." "What happened to him?" Tessa asked. "I shot him," Elijah said flatly, "not fatally." "He left town after that, headed for California, I heard," he sighed. "After I healed up physically, at least I tried to go back to my old ways. Took a job as a guard for a gold shipment. First bandits we encountered, I missed every shot, nearly got the whole escort killed." "So you retreated to your ranch," Tessa concluded. "Seemed the sensible thing to do," Elijah agreed. "Until yesterday, when 3 men nearly killed me for $100 and I was saved by a woman I'd never met." "Life has a way of humbling us all eventually," Tessa said. "The question is what we do afterward." Their conversation drifted to lighter topics as their watch continued: books they'd read, places they'd seen, dreams they'd once had. Elijah found himself sharing thoughts and memories he hadn't spoken of in years, drawn out by Tessa's genuine interest and lack of judgment. When their shift ended and they returned to camp, Elijah realized something had shifted between them, a connection formed through shared confidences and mutual respect. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was something equally rare in the harsh landscape of the West, the beginning of true friendship. The posse caught up with the outlaws the following afternoon, finding them camped in an abandoned mining settlement nestled in the foothills. The sheriff divided their forces, positioning men to cut off escape routes while the main group approached from the front. "Hawkins, you and Miss Porter circle around to the east," Sheriff Wallace instructed. "There's a ridge there that overlooks the camp. If they try to run that way, you'll have clear shots." Elijah nodded, appreciating that the sheriff had given them a position that played to their strengths: stationary marksmanship, rather than the running gunfight that would likely ensue in the camp. They reached the ridge without incident, dismounting and securing their horses before finding positions that afforded them a good view of the settlement below. Through his spyglass, Elijah counted 5 men, the 3 who had attacked him, plus 2 others. 5 against 12, Tessa observed. They'll surrender if they have any sense. Men like that rarely do, Elijah replied, checking his rifle. The sheriff's plan was simple: surround them, call for surrender, and only open fire if they resisted. When the main group rode into the settlement, however, the outlaws reacted immediately with gunfire, scattering to defensive positions. From their vantage point, Elijah and Tessa could see what the others couldn't: 2 of the outlaws slipping out the back of a dilapidated shack, headed directly for their position. "They're coming our way," Elijah warned, shifting his aim. Tessa nodded, levering a round into her Winchester. "I'll take the one on the left." The men below were moving quickly but cautiously, using the scrub brush for cover as they made their escape. Elijah recognized one as the leader who had taunted him during the ambush. "Hold until they're in the clearing," he murmured, sighting down his rifle. Despite the confidence he'd shown during the bottle shooting contest, he felt the familiar doubt creeping in. At this distance, with moving targets. "Steady," Tessa whispered beside him, as if sensing his concern. "You've got this." The outlaws reached the clearing, picking up speed as they thought they'd made their escape. Elijah and Tessa fired almost simultaneously. Tessa's target went down immediately, clutching his leg. Elijah's shot struck the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. "Reload." Elijah called, working the lever on his rifle as the wounded leader raised his pistol toward their position. Before either could fire again, the wounded man collapsed, another shot having found its mark from one of the posse members who had noticed the escape attempt. The gunfire in the settlement tapered off shortly after, and signals from below indicated that the remaining outlaws had surrendered. Elijah and Tessa descended from their position to join the others, leading their prisoner between them. "Good work, you two," Sheriff Wallace acknowledged grudgingly when they reached the settlement. "Though I'd have preferred them alive for hanging." "He'll live," Tessa said, nodding toward their wounded captive. "Just needs a bandage and a good doctor before his date with the judge." The return journey to Julesburg was slower than the pursuit had been, with 3 prisoners in tow and 2 bodies draped over horses. The mood among the posse was triumphant, but subdued. They'd achieved their objective, but 2 of their own had been wounded in the exchange of gunfire. As they rode, Elijah found himself watching Tessa, the way she sat easily in the saddle, the competent manner in which she'd handled herself throughout the mission, the respect she'd gradually earned from even the most skeptical members of the posse. There was something about her that drew him, something beyond her obvious beauty or her skill with firearms. Perhaps, he thought, it was simply that she truly saw him when others saw only what he lacked. They reached Julesburg as the sun was setting, a crowd gathering as word spread of their success. The prisoners were delivered to the jail, the wounded to the doctor, and the rest of the posse dispersed to celebrate at the saloon. "Will you join us for a drink, Miss Porter?" One of the men asked, his earlier disdain replaced with genuine respect. Tessa smiled but shook her head. "Another time, perhaps. I need to get back to my ranch. Been away longer than I planned." The man nodded and turned to Elijah. "Hawkins, you coming?" Elijah hesitated, surprised by the invitation. It had been a long time since he'd been welcomed in such company. "Not tonight," he decided. "I should see Miss Porter safely on her way." As the others headed for the saloon, Elijah and Tessa retrieved their horses from the livery. "You don't need to escort me," Tessa said as they mounted up. "I'm quite capable of finding my way home in the dark." "I don't doubt it," Elijah replied, "but I'd welcome the company if you don't mind." They rode out of town in companionable silence, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above them. The events of the past few days had changed something for Elijah, awakened parts of himself he'd thought were gone forever. "You shot well today," Tessa commented as they rode. "For a man who claimed he couldn't aim anymore," Elijah chuckled softly. "I got lucky." "Luck is what we call skill when we don't want to acknowledge it," Tessa replied. "You're still the man you were before you lost your eye, Elijah, just different." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice stirred something in his chest. Maybe you're right, he conceded, though I'm not sure I want to be that man anymore. Oh, Tessa asked, curious, and who do you want to be? Elijah considered the question seriously. Someone worthy of the second chance I've been given. Someone, he hesitated. Someone who sees what's in front of him before it's too late. Their eyes met in the moonlight and something unspoken passed between them. For a moment, Elijah thought Tessa might say more, but they had reached the turn-off to her ranch. "This is me," she said, gesturing toward the path that led to the old Wilson place. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Hawkins." "Elijah," he corrected gently. "After all we've been through, I think we've earned the right to first names, don't you?" A smile touched her lips. "Elijah, then, and I'm Tessa." "Tessa," he repeated, liking the feel of her name. "Will I see you again?" "I imagine so," she replied. "It's a small community after all." "That's not what I meant," Elijah said, finding courage from somewhere deep inside. "Would you allow me to call on you properly? Perhaps Sunday after church?" Tessa's smile widened. "I'd like that," she said, "very much." As he watched her ride toward her ranch, Elijah felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of self-pity and bitterness that had become his constant companion was lifting, replaced by something he had almost forgotten: hope. The following Sunday, Elijah arrived at the small church in Julesburg early, having spent more time than he cared to admit ensuring his appearance was presentable. He'd trimmed his beard, polished his boots, and donned his one good suit rarely worn since his injury had made public appearances uncomfortable. He scanned the gathering congregation, trying not to appear too eager, but found no sign of Tessa. As the service began, he resigned himself to the possibility that she had changed her mind. Then, just as the first hymn was announced, the door opened, and Tessa slipped in, slightly flushed as if she'd hurried. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which was arranged neatly beneath a modest hat. Their eyes met across the church, and her smile sent a warmth through Elijah that had nothing to do with the crowded room. After the service, they stood in the churchyard, somewhat awkward now that the moment for their planned outing had arrived. "I apologize for being late," Tessa said. "One of my calves decided this morning was the perfect time to find a hole in the fence." Elijah chuckled. "No apology needed." "I'm just glad you came." "Did you think I wouldn't?" she asked, her head tilted slightly. "I wasn't sure," Elijah admitted. "It's been a long time since I've done anything like this." Tessa's expression softened. "For me as well, so perhaps we can be uncertain together." She glanced around at the dispersing churchgoers. "What did you have in mind for today?" Elijah had given this considerable thought. "I thought we might have a picnic," he suggested. "There's a nice spot by the river about a mile out of town, if that sounds agreeable." "It sounds perfect," Tessa replied. They retrieved their horses, upon which Elijah had secured a basket containing a simple but thoughtful meal: fried chicken, cornbread, and apple pie he'd purchased from the hotel restaurant, along with a bottle of lemonade. The spot he'd chosen was indeed lovely, a grassy bank beside the South Platte River, shaded by cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled softly in the spring breeze. They spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked the food, falling into easy conversation as they ate. Elijah found himself relaxing as the afternoon progressed, drawn out of his shell by Tessa's warm manner and genuine interest. They discovered shared experiences: both had lost mothers young, both had traveled extensively before settling in Colorado, both harbored a love for the same books. "How did you come to be so proficient with firearms?" Elijah asked as they finished the pie. "Most women I've known view guns as a necessary evil at best." "My father taught me after he came back from the war," Tessa explained. "He said if something happened to him, I needed to be able to protect myself and my younger sisters." She smiled at the memory. "He was a good teacher, very patient, said I had a natural eye for it." "He was right," Elijah observed. "I've seen professional gunmen with less skill." "What about you?" Tessa asked. "Were you always handy with a gun?" Elijah nodded. "Even as a boy. My father was a gunsmith in Pennsylvania. I grew up around firearms, learned their mechanics before I was tall enough to aim them properly." He gazed out at the river. "The war honed those skills in ways I never wanted." Afterward, I drifted west like so many others, finding work where my particular talents were valued or feared. And now, Tessa asked gently, what do you want from life now? It was a profound question, one Elijah had avoided asking himself for too long. Peace, I suppose, he said finally. Not just the absence of conflict, but contentment, purpose. He looked at her. Connections that matter. Something in his gaze must have communicated more than his words, for Tessa's cheeks colored slightly. Those are worthy goals, she said softly. And you? Elijah asked. What does Tessa Porter want from life? She considered the question, absently weaving a piece of grass between her fingers. When I came west, it was to prove I could make it on my own, that I didn't need a husband or family to have value. She glanced up at him. But I'm beginning to think independence and connection aren't mutually exclusive. That perhaps being strong means knowing when to stand alone and when to stand with others. The conversation turned to more immediate concerns, the challenges of ranching, the weather prospects for summer, the latest news from back east. As the afternoon waned, they packed up the remains of their picnic and prepared to depart. Thank you for today, Tessa said as Elijah helped her mount her horse. I can't remember when I've enjoyed an afternoon more. The pleasure was mine, Elijah replied sincerely. Perhaps we could do this again. I'd like that, Tessa said, very much. As they rode back toward town, Elijah found himself contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought Tessa into his life. Had those outlaws not attacked him on the road that day, had she not happened along at that precise moment? The thought of never knowing her made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't experienced in years. They parted in Julesburg with a promise to meet again the following Sunday, and as Elijah rode home to his lonely cabin, he realized something had fundamentally shifted within him. The future, which for so long had seemed a bleak continuation of a diminished present, now held possibilities he was eager to explore. Over the weeks that followed, Elijah and Tessa fell into a pattern of regular meetings, Sunday outings after church, occasional weekday visits to each other's ranches, shared meals in town when their duties brought them to Julesburg on the same day. Each encounter deepened their connection, revealing new facets of each other that only increased their mutual regard. Elijah began to take more care with his appearance and his property, repainting his cabin and repairing fences that had been neglected. He found himself practicing his marksmanship again, not from a need to prove himself, but from a rekindled appreciation for a skill that had once defined him. For her part, Tessa seemed to soften slightly in Elijah's presence, allowing glimpses of vulnerability beneath her capable exterior. She shared stories of her family back east, of the struggles she'd faced as a woman alone in the West, of dreams she'd set aside in the pursuit of independence. The townsfolk noticed the developing relationship, of course. Julesburg was too small for such things to pass unremarked. Most viewed it with approval. Elijah's reemergence into community life was welcomed, and Tessa's unconventional status as a female rancher had always raised eyebrows. Not all reactions were positive, however. Jenkins, the man who had challenged Elijah before the posse rode out, made his disapproval known one evening in the saloon. "Heard you've been courting the Porter woman, Hawkins," he said loudly as Elijah nursed a rare whiskey at the bar. "Guess it makes sense, damaged goods finding comfort with each other." The saloon went quiet, men tensing in anticipation of violence. Elijah set his glass down slowly, turning to face Jenkins. "I suggest you apologize for that remark," he said quietly. Jenkins smirked. "Or what, one eye?" "You'll miss when you try to shoot me." Elijah's hand didn't move toward his gun. Instead, he took a step closer to Jenkins. "Miss Porter is a lady of quality and character, and I won't have her name disrespected. As for me," he smiled thinly. "Well, I may be damaged goods, but I can still put a man like you in the ground if pressed." Something in Elijah's calm certainty must have given Jenkins pause. After a tense moment, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant," he muttered, though his eyes said otherwise. "Just making conversation." "Find another topic," Elijah suggested, turning back to his drink. The incident, minor as it was, crystallized something for Elijah: the depth of his feelings for Tessa, and his willingness to defend not just her honor but the connection they were building, regardless of others' opinions. June gave way to July, bringing with it scorching days and occasional violent thunderstorms that swept across the plains. During one such storm, Elijah was working in his barn when he heard hooves approaching at speed. He emerged to find Tessa dismounting from her mare, soaked to the skin and clearly distressed. "Tessa, what's happened?" he asked, ushering her into the barn out of the downpour. "Lightning strike," she gasped, pushing wet hair from her face. "Hit the north pasture fence, cattle scattered. Miguel's trying to round them up, but with this weather." She gestured helplessly at the storm raging outside. Elijah didn't hesitate. "Give me 2 minutes to saddle up and grab my slicker." Together they rode through the deluge to Tessa's ranch, where they found Miguel already having secured about half the herd. The rest had fled in panic, some heading toward the river where the banks were treacherous after days of rain. For hours they worked in the storm, Elijah putting his tracking skills to use despite the limited visibility and his compromised eyesight. By nightfall, they had recovered all but 3 of the cattle, though all 3 humans were exhausted, drenched, and mud-covered. "We'll find the others tomorrow," Elijah assured Tessa as they unsaddled their horses in her barn. "They can't have gone far." Miguel excused himself to his quarters after securing the recovered cattle, leaving Elijah and Tessa alone in the lantern-lit barn. "Thank you," Tessa said softly, her usual composure momentarily cracked by the day's stress. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You'd have managed," Elijah replied, certain of it, "but I'm glad I could be here." Tessa stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "You're soaked through," she observed, reaching up to brush a strand of wet hair from his forehead. Her fingers lingered near his eye patch, a question in her gaze. Understanding her unspoken curiosity, Elijah gently took her hand and guided it to the leather patch. "It doesn't hurt anymore," he said quietly. "Not physically, at least. May I?" she asked, her fingers poised at the edge of the patch. Elijah nodded, his heart pounding as she carefully lifted the patch away, revealing the scarred socket beneath. He held his breath, waiting for the revulsion he'd come to expect. Instead, Tessa's expression held only tenderness as she traced the scar with gentle fingers. "Thank you for trusting me," she whispered. "You're the only one I would," Elijah admitted. The storm continued to rage outside, but in the shelter of the barn, something new and precious was taking form between them. Elijah's hand came up to cup Tessa's cheek, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his face. When their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long, lonely journey. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepened as they each let go of the fears and doubts that had kept them isolated for so long. Tessa was the first to pull away, though she remained in the circle of Elijah's arms. "You should stay tonight," she said. "The storm's too bad to ride back." "That wouldn't be proper," Elijah pointed out, though the thought of leaving her was increasingly difficult. A smile touched Tessa's lips. "I meant in the spare room, Elijah Hawkins, though your mind seems to be wandering elsewhere." Elijah chuckled, feeling a flush rise in his cheeks. "Can you blame me?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, Tessa Porter." "And you," she replied, her fingers tracing his jawline, "are far more than you give yourself credit for." They made their way to the house, the storm forgotten as they navigated this new territory between them, no longer merely friends, but something deeper and more profound. The following weeks saw their relationship blossom further, their lives becoming increasingly intertwined. Elijah found himself spending more time at Tessa's ranch than his own, helping with projects that had been beyond her and Miguel's capacity to handle alone. For her part, Tessa brought warmth and purpose back into Elijah's life, challenging him when he fell into old patterns of self-doubt and celebrating his strengths without dwelling on what he had lost. By August, the entire community recognized them as a couple, and speculation was rife about when, not if, they would formalize their relationship. Elijah himself had been considering the question, turning it over in his mind as he worked his land or lay awake at night. His decision crystallized one evening as they sat on Tessa's porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. They had been discussing practical matters: the upcoming cattle sale, repairs needed to her well, the possibility of combining some of their operations for efficiency. "It would be easier if we weren't managing two separate properties," Tessa observed, her tone casual though her eyes held a certain awareness as she glanced at Elijah. "It would at that," he agreed, sensing the conversation's underlying current, "though whose property would we focus on?" Tessa considered this. "Mine has better water access and more grazing land," she pointed out, "but yours has that stand of timber that would be valuable come winter." "Sounds like we need both," Elijah said, his heart rate increasing as he steered the conversation toward its inevitable conclusion. "Both would be ideal," Tessa agreed, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Though that would require a rather significant change in our current arrangements." Elijah turned to face her fully. "Tessa Porter, are you proposing to me?" he asked, his tone light though his eyes were serious. Tessa laughed, the sound warming him more than the evening air. "I believe I'm strongly hinting that a proposal would be favorably received," she clarified. "The actual asking remains your responsibility, Mr. Hawkins." Elijah took her hand in his, suddenly certain of his path forward. "I had planned something more formal," he admitted. "Perhaps dinner in town or a ride to that spot by the river you're so fond of." He squeezed her fingers gently. "But sitting here with you, talking about our future as if it's the most natural thing in the world, I can't imagine a better moment than this." He slid from his chair to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "I came west looking for a new beginning, but after my injury I thought that dream was over. I retreated into shadows, convinced that half a man deserved only half a life." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Then you rode into my life, guns blazing, and showed me that what I'd lost was nothing compared to what remained if I had the courage to claim it." Tessa's eyes glistened in the fading light, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I love you, Tessa Porter. Your strength, your kindness, your unflinching honesty. I love the way you see me not with pity, but with clarity." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple band with a modest diamond that had nevertheless cost him a significant portion of his savings. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tessa's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Elijah Hawkins, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to take her in his arms, Elijah felt a sense of completeness he had thought forever beyond his reach. They would face challenges. Certainly life in the West guaranteed that, but they would face them together, each making the other stronger for the bond between them. News of their engagement spread quickly through Julesburg and the surrounding ranches, met with general approval and some good-natured teasing from those who had watched their courtship unfold. They set the wedding date for October, when the cattle sales would be complete, and the harvest in, allowing friends and neighbors to attend without neglecting their responsibilities. Tessa wrote to her sisters in Pennsylvania, inviting them to the ceremony if they could make the journey. To her delight, both replied that they would come, bringing their families to meet the man who had captured their independent sister's heart. Preparations for the wedding occupied much of their time in the weeks that followed, but they also began the practical work of joining their lives and properties. They decided that Tessa's ranch would be their primary home, being the larger and better established of the two, but that Elijah's cabin would be maintained for use during cattle drives, or when work took them to that part of their combined land. Miguel, who had worked for Tessa since she purchased the Wilson place, expressed enthusiasm about the arrangement, particularly when Elijah suggested hiring an additional hand to help manage the expanded operation. "We'll need someone who can handle themselves," Elijah said as they discussed the matter one evening. "The more cattle we run, the more attractive we become to rustlers." "What about young Tom Wilson?" Tessa suggested. "Old man Wilson's grandson. He's been working odd jobs around town since he came back from school in Denver." "Good thought," Elijah agreed. I've seen him handle horses, seems to have a natural way with animals. Such practical discussions filled their days, interwoven with moments of tenderness and deepening intimacy as their wedding day approached. Elijah found himself marveling at how completely his life had transformed in the span of a few short months from isolated existence to a future rich with promise and partnership. Not everything was smooth sailing, of course. Jenkins continued to make the occasional cutting remark when their paths crossed in town, though he was careful to do so out of Tessa's hearing. More significantly, a dispute arose with a neighboring rancher over water, writes a common enough conflict in the arid West, but one that threatened to escalate beyond mere words. Simmons claims the creek on our northern boundary belongs entirely to him, Tessa explained one evening after returning from a tense encounter with their neighbor. Says his deed gives him exclusive rights and that we've been stealing his water for our cattle. Elijah frowned. The creek forms a natural boundary between the properties. By rights, we both have claim to it. That's what I told him, Tessa said, her frustration evident. He didn't take it well, threatened to dam it up on his side if we don't keep our cattle away. I'll ride over tomorrow, try to reason with him, Elijah offered. Maybe we can work out a formal agreement. The meeting with Simmons did not go as planned. The older rancher was obstinate, viewing any compromise as weakness. When Elijah suggested bringing in the county surveyor to establish the proper boundary, Simmons's response was blunt. I don't need no surveyor to tell me what's mine, he growled. And I don't need to be lectured by a one-eyed gunslinger playing at being a rancher. You and that woman think you're something special, but around here, we respect tradition and natural order. Elijah maintained his composure, though the effort cost him. The natural order, Mr. Simmons, is that water flows downhill and benefits all it touches. As for tradition, there's a long tradition of neighbors finding ways to coexist peacefully. Not much peaceful about you from what I hear, Simmons retorted. Killed your share of men before that knife took your eye, didn't you? That was a different life, Elijah said quietly. One I don't care to revisit, but make no mistake, I will protect what's mine. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them as Elijah departed, the dispute unresolved. He reported the conversation to Tessa that evening, concerned about the potential for further conflict. We could fence our side of the creek, Tessa suggested. Keep our cattle back a bit, use it only for necessary watering. We shouldn't have to, Elijah said, his jaw tight with frustration, but it might be the practical solution for now. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, Tessa. I'd hoped to bring you solutions, not more problems. Tessa moved to stand before him, her hands coming up to frame his face. Don't you see, Elijah, that's what marriage is, facing problems together. I didn't fall in love with you because I thought life would be easier. I fell in love with you because life is better with you in it, challenges and all. Her words eased the tension within him, reminding him yet again of the gift he'd been given in finding her. How did I get so lucky? He murmured, drawing her close. It wasn't luck, she replied, echoing his earlier words. It was skill. The water dispute with Simmons remained a concern as September gave way to October and their wedding day approached. They proceeded with their plan to fence their side of the creek, a concession that rankled but seemed the wisest course given Simmons's volatility. A week before the wedding, Tessa's sisters arrived from Pennsylvania, Sarah with her husband and 2 children, and Hannah, younger and unmarried but equally spirited. Their presence brought a festive atmosphere to the ranch, and Elijah found himself embraced by this extension of Tessa's family with a warmth that eased any lingering doubts about the step they were about to take. She never writes about men, Hannah confided to Elijah one evening as they sat around the fire after dinner. Not once in all her letters did she mention a suitor or even an interest. Then suddenly, she's engaged to be married. She studied him with eyes remarkably similar to Tessa's. You must be quite exceptional, Mr. Hawkins. Hardly that, Elijah replied, self-conscious under her scrutiny. If anyone is exceptional in this match, it's your sister. On that we agree, Hannah said with a smile, though I suspect you're selling yourself short. Tessa doesn't suffer fools or weaklings gladly. Sarah, the older sister, was more direct in her assessment. "You've brought our Tessa back to herself," she told Elijah as they watched Tessa playing with Sarah's children in the yard. "There's a lightness in her I haven't seen since before Father died. For that alone, I'd welcome you to our family." The wedding itself was a simple affair held in the Julesburg church with most of the community in attendance. Elijah stood at the altar, more nervous than he'd ever been facing down an armed opponent, as Tessa walked toward him on the arm of Sarah's husband, who had agreed to give her away in the absence of her father. She wore a dress of ivory silk, ordered from Denver for the occasion, her auburn hair adorned with small white flowers. But it was her smile that captivated Elijah, radiant and certain, full of promise for their shared future. The ceremony passed in a blur, though Elijah would forever remember the moment they exchanged vows. The feel of the ring as he slipped it onto Tessa's finger alongside her engagement band. The minister's pronouncement that they were husband and wife, and the kiss that sealed their union, a public declaration of a bond that had been forming since that first encounter on the dusty road outside Julesburg. The celebration afterward was held at their ranch, tables set up in the yard and laden with food contributed by neighbors and friends. Music from fiddles and guitars filled the air as the sun set, couples dancing in the space cleared for that purpose. Even Sheriff Wallace unbent enough to offer congratulations, though he couldn't resist a wry comment. "Never thought I'd see the day when Elijah Hawkins settled down," he said, shaking Elijah's hand. "Or when Miss Porter, Mrs. Hawkins now, I should say, found a man she couldn't outshoot." "Oh, I can still outshoot him," Tessa replied with a grin. "But he has other qualities to recommend him," the sheriff laughed. "I don't doubt it. You two take care of each other, you hear? This territory needs more decent folk putting down roots." As the celebration continued into the evening, Elijah found moments to observe his new wife from across the yard, her easy laughter as she danced with her brother-in-law, her gracious acceptance of well wishes from neighbors, the occasional glance she sent his way, full of promise for the night to come. Later, after the guests had departed and Tessa's family had retired to the rooms prepared for them, Elijah and Tessa stood alone on the porch of what was now truly their home. "Happy, Mrs. Hawkins?" Elijah asked, drawing her into his arms. "More than I ever thought possible," Tessa replied, her head resting against his chest. "And you, Mr. Hawkins, any regrets about tying yourself to a headstrong woman with unconventional ideas?" "Only that it took me so long to find you," Elijah said, lifting her chin gently to kiss her. "Though perhaps we each needed our separate journeys to be ready for this one we're beginning together." As they moved inside to the privacy of their bedroom, Elijah reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought him to this moment. The war that had taught him to kill, the years of drifting that had hardened him, the injury that had nearly broken him, all leading ultimately to Tessa, to love, to a future he could never have imagined in his darkest days. The weeks following the wedding were a time of adjustment and joy as they settled into married life. Tessa's sisters and their families departed after a fortnight, leaving behind promises of future visits and invitations to come east when circumstances allowed. With winter approaching, they focused on preparations for the harsh months ahead, ensuring sufficient hay was stored for the cattle, repairing buildings to withstand the coming snow, preserving food from the garden's final harvest. Working side by side, they fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing, each complementing the other's strengths and supporting where weaknesses existed. The dispute with Simmons appeared to have subsided, their concession in fencing their side of the creek seemingly enough to satisfy him for the time being. Elijah remained watchful, however, knowing that such conflicts often simmered beneath the surface in the competitive world of ranching. November brought the first heavy snowfall, transforming the landscape into a blanket of white that stretched to the horizon. With outdoor work limited by the weather, evenings were spent in domestic pursuits, Tessa mending or knitting by the fire while Elijah read aloud from one of their shared favorite books, or both engaged in planning for the spring expansion of their herd. It was during one such evening that Tessa set aside her sewing and regarded Elijah with an expression that immediately caught his attention. "Is something wrong?" he asked, marking his place in the book. "Not wrong," she replied carefully, "but perhaps unexpected." She took a deep breath. "Elijah, I believe I'm with child." For a moment, Elijah could only stare, the words slowly penetrating. Then joy washed through him, so intense it was almost painful. "A baby," he whispered, moving to kneel beside her chair. "You're sure?" Tessa nodded, her own emotions evident in her glistening eyes. "As sure as I can be. It's early yet, the child wouldn't arrive until summer, but all the signs are there." Elijah placed a gentle hand on her still flat abdomen, overwhelmed by the miracle taking form beneath his touch. "A child," he repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Our child. Are you pleased?" Tessa asked, a hint of vulnerability in her question. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," Elijah assured her, gathering her into his arms. "I never thought, after everything, to have this chance with you." He couldn't complete any thought, his heart too full for words. Tessa's fingers traced the edge of his eye patch, a gesture that had become one of intimacy between them. "Our child will know what a remarkable man their father is," she said softly. "How he found strength where others would have found only despair. How he sees more with one eye than most men see with two." The months that followed were filled with preparations, both practical and emotional, as they anticipated the new addition to their family. Their home, already warmed by their love for each other, seemed to expand with possibilities for the future. The winter proved challenging, with several severe storms that tested their preparations and resolve. During one particularly fierce blizzard in January, they lost several cattle despite their best efforts to protect the herd. The setback was disappointing but not devastating, and they faced it, as they did all challenges together, with a resilience born of their complementary strengths. As spring approached and Tessa's condition became more apparent, they hired an additional hand as planned, young Tom Wilson. Eager to learn the ranching business and respectful of both Elijah's experience and Tessa's authority, despite her gender and condition. The water dispute with Simmons flared again with the thaw, when he discovered several of their cattle had broken through the fence during the winter to drink from the creek. His reaction was more measured than before, perhaps tempered by the news of Tessa's pregnancy which had spread through the community, but the underlying tension remained. "We need a more permanent solution," Elijah said after yet another tense encounter with their neighbor. "This can't continue indefinitely, especially with the baby coming." "Perhaps we should consider selling that northern section," Tessa suggested reluctantly. "It's not our best grazing land and it would remove the boundary issue entirely." Elijah shook his head. "That feels like giving in to bullying. Besides, with our family growing, we need every acre." He paced the room, thinking, what if we offered to build a proper water sharing system, controlled access points for both herds maintained jointly? The idea had merit, though convincing Simmons to participate would be challenging. Still, it offered a potential path forward that preserved both their resources and their dignity. Spring blossomed across the prairie, bringing new calves to their herd and progressive changes to Tessa's body as their child grew within her. Despite her increasing size, she remained active in the ranch's operations, though she grudgingly accepted more limitations as her due date approached. "I'm not an invalid," she protested when Elijah insisted on taking over a task she'd been about to begin. "No, you're the most capable woman I've ever known," Elijah agreed, his hand gently resting on her swollen abdomen. "You're also carrying precious cargo. Indulge me in wanting to protect you both." Tessa's expression softened. "You're a good man, Elijah Hawkins. Our child is fortunate to have you for a father." Those words warmed Elijah more than any praise of his ranching skills or his former prowess with a gun ever could. The prospect of fatherhood both terrified and exhilarated him, the responsibility immense, the potential for joy equally so. As Tessa's time drew near, they arranged for a midwife to stay at the ranch. Sarah had also written promising to come when the baby was expected, bringing her experience as a mother to support her sister through the birth. It was during this period of anticipation that the situation with Simmons finally reached a critical point. One morning in early June, Miguel reported that someone had demolished a section of their fence along the creek boundary and driven stakes into the creek bed, diverting the water flow away from their land. Elijah rode out to inspect the damage, his anger growing as he saw the deliberate nature of the sabotage. The diverted creek had already created a muddy mess on Simmons's side, but more concerning was the loss of water flow to their grazing land during what was shaping up to be a dry summer. He was examining the crude dam when Simmons appeared on the opposite bank, rifle in hand. "This has gone too far, Simmons," Elijah called across the diminished creek. "This hurts your land as much as ours." "It's my water to do with as I please," Simmons replied, his weathered face set in stubborn lines. "Maybe now you'll understand that I don't make idle threats. All we've ever wanted is a reasonable arrangement," Elijah said, fighting to keep his temper in check. "There's plenty of water for both our herds if we manage it properly." "There's nothing to manage," Simmons insisted. "The water's mine, and I'm tired of your cattle drinking what belongs to me." Elijah took a deep breath, considering his next words carefully. "My wife is due to deliver our child any day now," he said. "I'd rather not be fighting with neighbors at such a time. What will it take to resolve this once and for all?" Something flickered in Simmons's eyes at the mention of the baby, perhaps a distant memory of his own family, long grown and gone. "Stay off my land, keep your cattle away from my water, and we'll have no more trouble," he said, his tone slightly less belligerent. "And the creek," Elijah pressed. "We need that water, Simmons. You know as well as I do that there's no other reliable source on that section of our land." Simmons was silent for a long moment, the rifle still held loosely in his hands. Finally, he spoke. "West end of your property, there's a natural depression. With some work, you could create a holding pond, catch the runoff from the hills. Might be enough for your needs if you don't get too ambitious with your herd size." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the first constructive suggestion Simmons had offered. "I'll consider it," Elijah said. "In the meantime, will you remove that dam as a gesture of good faith while we work this out?" Another lengthy silence followed before Simmons gave a curt nod. "I'll take it out, but don't mistake it for weakness, Hawkins. I protect what's mine." "As do I," Elijah replied evenly. "We're not so different in that regard." He rode home with mixed feelings, relief that the immediate crisis had been averted, frustration that a true resolution remained elusive, concern about the additional work creating a pond would entail. But most of all, he felt a growing urgency to secure their home and land before the baby arrived, to create the safe and stable environment every child deserved. Elijah's deadline proved more pressing than he realized. That very night, Tessa went into labor, her waters breaking as they prepared for bed. "It's time," she said simply, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. The next hours were a blur of activity, sending Miguel to fetch the midwife from her home in Julesburg, preparing the bedroom according to the instructions Sarah had sent, boiling water, gathering clean linens. Through it all, Tessa maintained a remarkable composure, her breathing controlled as the contractions intensified. The midwife, Mrs. Abernathy, a no-nonsense woman who had delivered most of Julesburg's children over the past decade, arrived just as Tessa's labor entered its more serious phase. "You've done well," she told Elijah after examining Tessa. "Now make yourself useful elsewhere. This is women's business." Being banished from the bedroom was harder than Elijah had anticipated. Each cry or moan from behind the closed door sent a spike of fear through him. He paced the front room like a caged animal, alternating between prayer and profanity as the hours dragged on. Dawn was breaking when Mrs. Abernathy finally emerged, her apron stained but a smile on her lined face. "You have a son, Mr. Hawkins," she announced. "A fine, healthy boy. And your wife is doing well, though exhausted as you'd expect." Elijah felt his knees weaken with relief and joy. "A son," he repeated, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. "May I see them?" "Of course. Just remember she needs rest. The hard work is done, but recovery takes time." Nothing could have prepared Elijah for the sight that greeted him in the bedroom. Tessa, her face drawn with exhaustion but radiant with joy, cradling a small bundle against her breast. She looked up as he entered, her smile warming him to his core. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Elijah approached the bed with reverence, his heart hammering as he gazed down at the tiny face nestled against Tessa's chest. The baby had a shock of dark hair and skin still flushed from the ordeal of birth, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the world. "He's perfect," Elijah whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch his son's cheek. "You're perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Tessa asked. Elijah hesitated, suddenly aware of his rough hands and limited depth perception. "I don't want to hurt him." "You won't," Tessa assured him, carefully transferring the swaddled infant to his arms. The weight of his son, so slight yet so significant, nearly undid Elijah. This tiny life, this perfect blend of himself and Tessa, represented everything he had once thought beyond his reach: family, future, hope. Tears filled his good eye as he cradled the boy, marveling at the miracle they had created. "What shall we name him?" Tessa asked, watching them with tired contentment. They had discussed names but had not settled on a final choice, wanting to meet their child first. Looking down at the strong features already evident in the newborn's face, Elijah knew. "William," he said, "after your father, William Thomas Hawkins." Tessa's eyes glistened. "It's perfect," she agreed. "My father would have been honored." She patted the bed beside her. "Sit with me, both of you." Elijah carefully settled beside her, their son cradled between them. In that moment, despite the unresolved conflict with Simmons, despite the challenges of ranching in the unforgiving West, despite his own lingering insecurities about his disability, Elijah knew a peace and completeness he had never thought possible. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For what?" Tessa asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "For finding me that day on the road," Elijah replied. "For seeing past what I'd lost to what remained, for giving me a reason to become more than I believed I could be." He looked down at their son. "For this, for everything." Tessa's hand found his, their fingers intertwining as they had that first day when she'd said those words that had begun to heal his wounded soul. "It ain't pity." And it wasn't. It was love, powerful, transformative, enduring. A love that had seen beyond scars and limitations to the heart beneath. A love that had created new life and new beginnings where once there had been only endings. As young William slept peacefully in his arms, Elijah Hawkins, once feared gunslinger, once broken man, now husband and father, made a silent promise to himself and to his family. He would live each day worthy of the second chance he had been given. He would build something lasting on the foundation of love Tessa had helped him rediscover. And he would ensure that his son grew up knowing that true strength came not from a steady aim or a fearsome reputation, but from the courage to remain open to life's possibilities, even after loss. The first year of William's life brought changes to the Hawkins ranch that went beyond the practical adjustments required by a baby's presence. There was a softening to their home, a sense of future and purpose that infused even the most mundane tasks with meaning. The spare room became a nursery, decorated with Tessa's handmade quilts and toys carved by Elijah during the quiet evenings. William grew rapidly, a strong and curious child with his mother's determined spirit and his father's watchful nature. His first smile, first laugh, first tentative crawl, each milestone was celebrated as the miracle it was, particularly by Elijah, who found fatherhood to be a profound source of joy and redemption. The water dispute with Simmons reached an unexpected resolution when the older rancher suffered a fall from his horse that autumn. Finding him injured on the trail, Elijah brought him to their ranch, where Tessa tended his broken arm and concussion until his son could arrive from Denver. The enforced proximity led to conversations that would have been impossible under other circumstances. Simmons, his defenses lowered by pain and medication, spoke of his own struggles as a young rancher, of the wife he had lost to illness, of his disappointment when his only son chose law over ranching. "Land's all I got," he admitted during one such conversation. Been fighting for it so long, I forgot there might be other ways. When he was well enough to return home, something had shifted in their relationship. The dam remained removed from the creek, and while Simmons maintained his claim to the water, he no longer objected to their cattle drinking from the southern bank. For his part, Elijah began work on the holding pond Simmons had suggested, recognizing the wisdom in having multiple water sources regardless of their neighbor's temperament. By the following spring, the pond was finished, a substantial project that enhanced the value of their property while providing a reliable water source for the expanding herd. As William's first birthday approached, Tessa made an announcement that echoed her revelation of the previous year. "I believe we'll need to expand the nursery," she told Elijah one evening as they watched their son play on a blanket before the fire. "Come autumn, William will have a brother or sister." Elijah's reaction was no less joyful for being expected. Their life together had been blessed beyond measure, and the prospect of adding to their family only increased his gratitude for the path they had walked together. "I love you," he said simply, drawing her close. "More each day, though I wouldn't have thought it possible." The years that followed saw the Hawkins ranch prosper and grow, as did the family that called it home. William was joined by a sister, Emma Grace, born in September of 1877, and later by another brother, James Robert, who arrived in the summer of 1880. Elijah's skill as a rancher grew alongside his confidence as a father and husband. The missing eye, once the defining feature of his self-perception, became merely an aspect of his appearance notable to strangers but unremarkable to those who knew him well. His children grew up seeing nothing strange about their father's patch, accepting it as naturally as they did his height or the color of his hair. Tessa continued to manage much of the ranch's business affairs, her sharp mind for figures and negotiation complementing Elijah's practical knowledge of cattle and land. Together, they built an operation respected throughout the county, known for fair dealing and quality stock. They faced challenges, of course drought years that tested their resources, a bout of cattle fever that threatened the herd, the normal conflicts and compromises of any marriage spanning decades. But through it all, they maintained the partnership that had begun on that dusty road outside Julesburg, each making the other stronger for the bond between them. As the 19th century drew to a close, and their children began to forge their own paths, William showing a talent for veterinary medicine, Emma a passion for teaching, young James already demonstrating his father's affinity for ranching, Elijah often reflected on the strange and winding journey that had brought him to this life. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the western sky, he shared these thoughts with Tessa, whose auburn hair was now threaded with silver but whose eyes remained as bright and perceptive as the day they met. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "how different our lives might have been if you hadn't come along that day? If those men hadn't attacked me, or if you'd chosen another route to town?" Tessa considered the question with her customary thoughtfulness. "I believe," she said finally, "that some souls are meant to find each other, regardless of the paths they take." She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the familiar gesture that still warmed him after all these years. "Perhaps it wouldn't have been that day or that road, but I think we would have found each other somehow." "A comforting thought," Elijah agreed, "though I'm grateful we didn't have to wait any longer than we did." "As am I," Tessa replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Every day with you has been a gift, Elijah Hawkins, even the difficult ones." They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the first stars appearing overhead. Their home glowed warmly behind them, the sounds of their youngest son practicing his reading drifting through the open window. In the distance, their cattle grazed peacefully on land that had flourished under their stewardship. It was, Elijah reflected, a life he could never have imagined during those dark days after his injury when he'd retreated from the world, convinced that what he'd lost had defined his worth. Tessa had shown him otherwise, had seen past his scars to the man beneath, had offered not pity but partnership, not sympathy but strength. "I love you," he said, the words no less powerful for having been spoken countless times over the years. "And I love you," Tessa replied, her smile visible even in the gathering darkness. With both eyes wide open. As they rose to go inside, Elijah paused for one last look at the land they had built together, the legacy they would one day leave to their children. It stretched before him, vast and beautiful in the moonlight, a testament to what could be achieved when two people faced life's challenges together, each making the other more than they could have been alone. It wasn't the future he had once envisioned for himself in those restless days after the war when he drifted west, seeking something he couldn't name. It was infinitely better, richer, deeper, more meaningful than any life his younger self could have imagined. All because a wounded man and a courageous woman had found each other on a dusty Colorado road and recognized in each other the possibility of something extraordinary. Something that wasn't pity, but love enduring, transformative, and true.